Hello there. Welcome to Fundamentals of Biology, where today we're going to be talking about hormones and the endocrine system. So during this session, we're going to be having a look at endocrine glands, and these are the glands around the body that actually produce and secrete hormones. And then we're going to focus on the different types of hormones, specifically that humans produce. Then we'll go on to then talk about hormonal pathways, and this is the way in which hormones actually act on the body. And then we'll finish off by talking about the role of a few specific hormones in homeostasis. And homeostasis is the process by which an organism is able to regulate its internal environment. And this is something that we're going to go on to investigate in the coming sessions, and we'll do a bit of an introduction to this today. When it comes to coordination and communication throughout an animal's body, there are two systems involved. They are the endocrine system and the nervous system. Now, we covered the nervous system in the previous session, so if you haven't seen that one, then I would recommend going back and having a look at that as well. But the nervous system is responsible for conveying high-speed electrical signals. So if you remember, those are what we refer to as action potentials, and they are sent along specialized cells called neurons. And those neurons, they will send signals that regulate other cells. So we talked about the fact that they can trigger muscle contractions and the secretion within endocrine glands and things like that. But essentially, the nervous system is responsible for detecting external and internal stimuli, processing that information, and then responding to it or sending out a response. It's very, very fast acting. And that's the key with the nervous system. It's incredibly quick. And action potentials are over very, very quickly. So a typical neuron can transmit hundreds of action potentials every second. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is a much more slow and long-acting system. So the endocrine system secretes hormones that coordinate slower but longer-acting responses. So rather than responding to a change in light going into our eye, or the reaction that we have when we accidentally touch a hot kettle or something like that, with the endocrine system, what we're doing is coordinating and managing things like reproduction, growth and development, metabolism, and also behavior. And we're also looking at things like our sleep and wake cycles, our libido, so sexual desire, and also the whole reproductive cycle. So the endocrine system is responsible for incredibly powerful changes within an animal's body. And if you think about it from within a human context, well, when we're born, we spend the first sort of 10 to 14 years or something like that just sort of growing. So we spend that time in childhood. We're growing and developing and learning about the world. And then puberty kicks in. And puberty kicks in and we start producing higher levels of testosterone specifically in males and estrogen specifically in females. And they will have huge changes or cause huge changes within the body, turning that individual from a child into an adult. So you think about the physical and mental changes that occur within you when you go through puberty. They're immense. And this is all down to the production or the increase in production and secretion of specific hormones. So hormones then are the body's long-distance regulators. So not only are they acting over sort of long periods of time, so they're controlling metabolism and growth and reproduction over the entire period of your life, but they're also able to they're also able to control body systems and processes across the whole body, even though you have small glands in very specific parts of the body. Animal hormones are chemical signals that are secreted directly into the circulatory system and communicate regulatory messages within the body. So if you have a endocrine gland, so endocrine glands are those glands that produce and secrete hormones. So if you have an endocrine gland within your brain, for instance, Well, you need to get that hormone to all parts of your body. Well, how do you do that? You put it into your circulatory system, you put it into your blood. And that way, that hormone is delivered over a long distance. It's delivered throughout the entire body. But that could raise a bit of a problem. If you've got hormones reaching all parts of the body, there could be a risk that cells that you don't want reacting to that hormone could react. But there's a way around that. So what we find is that hormones reach all parts of the body because they are secreted directly into the blood system, but only specific target cells respond. And that is because they are equipped to respond with specific receptor proteins. Hormones are secreted directly into the bloodstream. They are delivered to every part of the body, but only specific target cells respond to the hormones, because to do so, they have to have the correct receptors. And just to give you an indication of the immense power that hormones can have on an animal's body, well, we can look at the photo that we have on the slide in front of us. So something like insect metamorphosis is regulated entirely by hormones. So I mentioned to you about puberty within humans, but what we can also see with this butterfly here is that during the juvenile stage, so when the butterfly is still in the caterpillar stage, it is producing a specific hormone called juvenile hormone. And then it will go through its different instars, so its different stages where it goes through its molts. And then once it reaches a certain size or certain age, depending on species, it will stop producing or greatly reduce the amount of the juvenile hormone that's being produced. And that will then trigger the body to start developing the adult parts. So that's when it will go into metamorphosis. It will develop into a pupa, and then it will emerge as an adult butterfly. So the only thing that's preventing this from happening earlier is that the caterpillar is producing a specific hormone called juvenile hormone that helps it or makes it maintain or retain juvenile features. So it's an incredibly powerful chemical. And we see the same thing within metamorphosis within other animals as well. So the development of a tadpole into a frog is heavily dependent on specific hormones. So hormones, very, very powerful, and they are secreted into the entire body or around the entire body, but only specific target cells will react. That will be because they have specific receptors. When looking at endocrine glands, we see that they are typically ductless and they secrete hormones directly into the surrounding fluid, such as the interstitial fluid. They then move into the bloodstream where they are delivered around the body. And as we mentioned previously, only those target cells that have the correct receptors will respond to the hormone. And those receptors can either be embedded within the plasma membrane of the target cell, or they can actually be located within the cytoplasm of the cell, and in some cases actually inside the nucleus of the target cell. But only those target cells that have the right receptor proteins will respond to the hormones. And what we can see on the diagram here are the locations of the main endocrine glands within humans. And we actually see a lot of similarity in the endocrine glands and hormones they produce across all vertebrates. So whether we're looking at mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, or amphibians. But we're going to look at the main ones in humans at the moment. So starting up in the brain, we have the hypothalamus, which is a very important endocrine gland, as it's also part of the nervous system. So it acts as a bit of a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it has very important functions within the nervous system, but it's also what we refer to as a neurosecretory system. So it actually produces specific hormones like antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin that then are secreted by the pituitary gland. So we can see that just below the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland, which has two different sections to it, which we'll look at on the next slide. We also have the pineal gland, which is also located up in the brain. That's really important in regulating our sleep and wake cycles. Moving down into the area around our throat, we have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. So you can see that the butterfly, the blue butterfly shaped gland there is the thyroid gland. And then the parathyroid glands are these smaller sections located actually on the thyroid gland. Moving down here, you can see our kidneys, and located on top of the kidneys, you have the adrenal glands that produce epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine. Here we have the pancreas, so really important in producing insulin and glucagon for regulating blood glucose levels. And we'll look at these on the next slide. And then moving down into the gonads. So obviously in a male, we have the testes for producing testosterone. And in a female, that would be the ovaries for producing estrogen. So these are the main endocrine glands. And we are starting to discover more hormones produced within the human body. So the study of hormones is, in terms of what we know about them, is fairly recent. The science or endocrinology, the science of hormones, is a fairly recent development. Only been around for a little more than 100 years. I think that the actual term endocrinology, the term hormone, which means I excite, was coined back in 1905. So not that long ago, really. And so we're still learning a lot about hormones in the endocrine glands. And it's within the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've discovered that there's a hormone called leptin that's actually produced by some of our fat cells, for instance. So it's quite an interesting area of study at the moment, and there's probably a lot more to be discovered and a lot more to come out about hormones. But as it stands, these are the main endocrine glands within the human body. So these will be the ones that we focus on over the coming slides. So what actually are hormones then? Well, if you can remember back to the sessions that we did on biological molecules, so when we were looking at carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids, hopefully you'll remember that I highlighted some of them as we went through those topics. There are three main classes of molecules that function as hormones in vertebrates. So those three classes are polypeptides. So these are both proteins. So if you can remember, the difference between a polypeptide and a protein is that a polypeptide is a long chain of amino acids, and a protein is that long chain of amino acids that has then been folded up into a complex and very specific three-dimensional shape. So we can get specific proteins, but we can also just get peptides, so these long chains of amino acids. We can also get amines, so these are derived from amino acids. And then we can also get steroid hormones. So if you remember, these are a type of lipid, and the examples that we talked about, what feels like a long time ago, but in a session that we did on lipids, were cholesterol, estrogen, that you can see on the slide here, with the American spelling of estrogen. But you can see estrogen here that's produced within the ovaries. So we looked at cholesterol, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and vitamin D as examples of the steroid hormones. So these are our three main classes. They are essentially protein-based, amino acid-based, or they are lipid-based, so steroids. And what we can see on the next two slides actually are the main endocrine glands that we looked at on the previous slide, but also some of the main hormones that they produce. So there are around 50 hormones that have been identified within humans. And like I said, it's possible that there are more to come. But within those 50, I've just highlighted or included within this diagram some of the main ones. So we'll go through it. I won't read every word on the table. You can always go back over this and look at it in a bit more detail. And you'll be able to find this diagram within the Biology, a Global Approach textbook, biology textbook. Starting again at the top where we've got the hypothalamus, you can see here hormones released from the posterior pituitary gland and hormones that regulate the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus produces some hormones, specifically oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, that go down into the posterior pituitary, but it also regulates the action of the anterior pituitary. So here is the pituitary gland, which I mentioned comes in two different parts. So we've got the posterior, so obviously that's towards the rear, and then the anterior, which is towards the front. And the main hormones that we can see here, so on this table we have the gland, the actual hormone that's being produced, the chemical class, so is it a peptide or is it a steroid or is it an amine? And then we have some of the main actions. This isn't an exhaustive list of actions, but some of the main ones. And then what we also find is that a lot of hormones or a lot of endocrine glands are actually regulated by other hormones. So they tend to be regulated in some way. Let's just have a quick look at the pituitary gland. So we have oxytocin, which we can see there as a peptide, so a chain of amino acids. And then we can see some of the functions there. Stimulates contraction of uterus and mammary gland cells. What we also know is that it has a role to play in developing bonds within between individuals, so between parent and child, but also between partners. So when you're forming a relationship, oxytocin is produced and appears to have a role in strengthening bonds. We have antidiuretic hormone that promotes the retention of water within the kidneys. We have growth hormone that stimulates growth, particularly in the bones, and it also has a lot of play within the metabolic functions. So growth hormone is quite an interesting one because some people that end up with tumors within the pituitary end up producing growth hormone for too long. So typically the reason that we stop growing around sort of our late teens is because our growth hormone levels will start to taper off and eventually they'll stop. So we stop growing. But some people develop a tumor on the pituitary, so they continue to produce growth hormone, and that causes gigantism, which can be a big problem. So there's been lots of famous examples of giants in human history. I think one of the most famous ones was Andre the Giant, a famous famous wrestler in the American WWF, or what is now the WWE, back in the 80s and 90s. We also have prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone. So you can see that these are and luteinizing hormone as well, very important in different reproductive functions. Thyroid stimulating hormone, so important in the thyroid gland, which is very important in metabolism, but also calcium regulation. And then we've got the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, so secreting the glucocorticoids. Moving down into the thyroid and the parathyroid glands, where we have hormones here that are really intrinsic to metabolic processes, but also in regulating our blood calcium levels. So these are really important in homeostasis. And we'll talk a bit more about these later on. And then moving down into the pancreas, I've mentioned these earlier. We have insulin and glucagon. So these are antagonistic hormones that work against each other, if you like, or they carry out opposite functions to help regulate our blood glucose levels. And again, we'll look at these in a bit as well. I mentioned these just now. So we've got the adrenal glands that sit on top of our kidneys that produce the epinephrine and norepinephrine and the glucocorticoids. So these are all really, really important in sort of that fight or flight response. So you can see here raising blood glucose levels so we can get glucose to our muscles to produce ATP to power muscle contractions. But we've also got metabolic activities, constricting blood vessels. So there's all kinds of different functions that are going on here as a result of these specific hormones. And again, we'll talk a little bit about how that happens in a bit as well. And then we move down into the gonads, where we've got the testes and the ovaries. So very important in growth, development, reproduction. And then the pineal gland, so up in the brain again, which produces melatonin. And melatonin is very important in maintaining our circadian rhythms, such as our sleep and wake cycle. Those are the main glands and just some of the hormones that they produce and some of the functions that they carry out. How those different hormones act within the body and on specific target cells will be determined by the type of molecule that makes up the hormones. So we've seen that there are the proteins and peptides and amines and also the steroids, and each of them will have different modes of action. So what we can see here is that lipid-soluble hormones, so most notably the steroids, can pass easily through the plasma membranes of our cells, including the nuclear envelope around the nucleus. And that's because they're lipids, so they can pass freely through the phospholipid bilayer. Whereas a lot of the polypeptides and amines are water soluble, so they're polar, and this means that they cannot get through the phospholipid bilayer. So how do you think that would impact the location of the receptor proteins for those different hormones? Hopefully you've had a second to think about that. Let's see if you've got the answer right. Well, the solubility of a hormone will correlate with the location of receptors either inside or on the surface of the target cells. Hopefully you've worked out that if you've got a lipid-soluble hormone, so a steroid like testosterone or estrogen, well, it's more likely that the receptor for those hormones are going to be located inside the cell because the hormone can pass freely through the plasma membrane. However, if you have a water-soluble hormone like a polypeptide that cannot get through the phospholipid bilayer, so through the plasma membrane, well, it's going to be important that you have the receptor protein on the outside of that cell or embedded within the phospholipid bilayer or the plasma membrane. And that's what we see. So once your hormone is secreted into the bloodstream and you know that you've got the receptor either on the target cell or inside the target cell, how do they actually work? Well, they work within three specific ways. So the first thing that happens is reception. And this is where the hormone binds to the target cell's receptor proteins. Okay, so whether you've got your receptor protein on the plasma membrane or within the nucleus or within the cytoplasm of the cell, once the hormone binds to the receptor, that is what we refer to as reception. That will then trigger a cascade of events that we refer to as signal transduction, sometimes referred to as a signal transduction pathway. And this can be the creation the turning on of specific enzymes or the moving or changing of specific molecules. And it can often involve multiple steps, but ultimately you will end up with a response. And the response is obviously where we want to get to. So the hormone is received by the receptor protein. This triggers a signal transduction, so this cascade pathway, if you like, and that ultimately ends with a response. So let's have a look at each of these. So we'll take an example of a lipid-soluble hormone and then a water-soluble hormone, and we can look at how they can act. So we're actually going to start off with a water-soluble hormone. So what we can see here, water-soluble hormones bind to receptors within the plasma membrane, which we've already established. So if we look at the diagram on the right-hand side here, we can see up here our secretory cell. So this would be an endocrine gland. It's secreting the hormones into the interstitial fluid, which is the blue stuff here, that then moves into the blood. And then those hormones then get transported all the way around the body. But here we have a target cell, and you can see that the receptor protein is embedded within the plasma membrane. The hormone will bind to that receptor, and then that will trigger signal transduction. So you can see here, signal transduction pathway, sort of moving and changing the shape and positioning of specific molecules. And in this instance, we're getting a cytoplasmic response. So this might be something like switching on a particular enzyme, for instance. Or part of the transduction pathway can actually lead in to the nucleus, where we get something called a nuclear response. And this may be something like gene expression. So you get the switching on of a particular gene, which will then produce a specific protein. Binding to its receptor initiates this signal transduction pathway, leading to responses in the cytoplasm, such as enzyme activation, or it can go into the nucleus and lead to something like gene expression or changes in gene expression. So an example of this would be epinephrine or adrenaline, which triggers the release of messenger molecules that activate enzymes in liver cells and result in the release of glucose into the bloodstream. So why would that be important? Well, we can piece this together based on some of the topics that we've covered already. So we know that we can store glucose as glycogen within our liver and our muscles. And that glycogen will act as a readily available source of glucose that we can break down when we need to. And then that glucose can go into our muscles where it can go through cellular respiration to generate ATP. And that ATP can be used for muscle contractions. We've looked previously, in a previous session, we've looked at the sliding filament model, and we know that ATP is needed for those myosin heads. So we can tie all this together. So when the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system triggers fight or flight, well, one of the things that happens is that epinephrine or adrenaline is produced. That adrenaline will trigger the breakdown of glycogen within the liver to put more glucose within our bloodstream. That glucose can then go to our muscles to trigger ATP production, so we can contract those muscles so we can run or fight. So this is how we can tie together the whole process. Okay, and it all starts with this sort of secretion of hormones and the delivery of hormones to the target cells. So this is how water-soluble hormones, such as our proteins and peptides and amines, will work then, the receptor proteins embedded within the plasma membrane. Here we can see a lipid-soluble hormone, so a steroid, for instance. Well, as previously mentioned, these can pass freely through the plasma membrane. So again, we've got the secretory cell. The hormone moves via the bloodstream around the body. And here we can see the target cell, and notice here that there's no receptor protein within the plasma membrane. Instead, the hormone passes directly into the cytoplasm. And in this case, it's actually passing directly through the nuclear envelope as well. And the receptor protein is actually inside the nucleus. And what we're actually getting here is a change in gene expression. So we're actually getting the switching on, if you like, of a specific gene. So the response to a lipid-soluble hormone is usually a change in gene expression. So protein receptor complexes, like you can see here. So protein and receptor complex is just what we have when when the hormone is actually docked to the receptor protein. So protein receptor complexes regulate transcription of specific genes. So if you remember, transcription is where we start producing, or where we produce that section of messenger RNA, which will then be read by the ribosome and basically turned into a protein. Examples here then, testosterone and estrogen. Well, these will switch on specific genes that trigger the reproductive changes experienced during puberty. So the muscle development and increased growth associated with testosterone, and the changes in skeletal structure that we see within females, particularly around the pelvis. So all of these things will be triggered by the secretion of these specific hormones. With all of the different functions that hormones control within the body, how is it that we can get away with only having 50 different hormones? Or around 50 anyway. Well, it's because the same hormone will have very different effects on different target cells. And what makes the target cells different will be, well, as you can see here, they will have different receptors for the hormone, so the different proteins. You can have a different signal transduction pathway, or you can have different proteins for carrying out the response. Different target cells will have these three different things. So as an example, we can look at this diagram and we can follow three different responses to the hormone epinephrine or adrenaline. So what we know is that when epinephrine is released, one of the things it will do, it helps to prepare us for fight or flight. So it's one of the things that is one of the hormones that is produced during the fight or flight response, or at the response to the sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. So what we can see here, if we think about what we talked about in the previous session, when the fight or flight response kicks in, we know that blood is diverted away from our digestive system, and it is much more focused about delivering blood and oxygen and glucose to our muscles. So let's think about that. And here we can see adrenaline, and we're looking at intestinal blood vessels. So these are blood vessels going to our intestines. Well, here we can see that blood vessels have alpha receptors. Okay, so these are receptors for epinephrine, but they are specific proteins that are referred to as alpha receptors. So when epinephrine binds to those receptors, it triggers a response, which in this case is that the vessels, the blood vessels within the intestines constrict, so they get narrower. So this reduces the flow of blood to our intestines, which we know happens during fight or flight. Up here we can see epinephrine, and in this case we're looking at blood vessels within our skeletal muscle, and we have beta receptors. So an epinephrine or adrenaline will come in, it will bind to the beta receptors, and this time it has the complete opposite response. It causes the blood vessels within our skeletal muscles to dilate. So what that means is we're getting more blood flowing to our skeletal muscles, which is exactly what we want, because those muscles need more oxygen and they need more glucose to generate loads of ATP for muscle contractions. What we also know is we need lots of extra glucose to power those muscle contractions. So what we can see up here, we're looking at the hepatic cell, so liver cells, and we're still dealing with epinephrine. And in this case, we have the same type of receptor that we saw over here. So we've got beta receptors, but the target cell is completely different. So instead of looking at blood vessels, we're looking at liver cells. So here, epinephrine will bind to beta receptors within our liver cells, and this will cause glycogen deposits to break down into glucose. So you'll obviously have a transduction pathway, which will switch on a specific enzyme that starts hydrolyzing or breaking down glycogen into glucose. The same hormone, two different receptors, three different responses, because we've got three different types of cell, if you like. Okay, so this is how we can have all of these different functions that are controlled by 50 different hormones within the body. Now that we know a little bit about hormones, what they are and where they're produced and how they act, let's have a look at some specific examples in a bit more detail then. So I mentioned right at the beginning about this process of homeostasis, this ability for an animal's body to regulate its internal environment to maintain a steady state, independent or regardless of what's going on around it. And we're going to investigate some more examples of this in coming sessions. But today I want to just finish this session off really by looking at a couple of examples of blood glucose and blood calcium levels. So these are things that need to be maintained within specific limits. So when it comes to the control of blood glucose, we are relying on insulin and glucagon. And these are, as I've mentioned previously, these are antagonistic hormones. So antagonistic doesn't mean that they're necessarily directly fighting each other. It just means that they work opposing each other. So one does one thing and the other one does the opposite. So insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones that help maintain glucose homeostasis. The pancreas, as you can see, the pancreas in this diagram here, and you can see where it's located. So you can see the liver. Behind the liver here, this is the stomach, leading down into the intestines. So you can see the pancreas and the gallbladder, spleen over here. So the pancreas has clusters of endocrine cells called the Islets of Langerhans. So another one of those fantastic biology names that seems like it should be in the Lord of the Rings. But we've got the Islets of Langerhans, and within the Islets of Langerhans we have alpha cells, and these produce glucagon. And then we also have beta cells, or beta cells. I thought I was American then for a second. We have beta cells that produce insulin. Okay, so within the pancreas, we have, sometimes you'll just hear these referred to as pancreatic islets. So pancreatic islets, or the Islets of Langerhans, which are located within the pancreas. Importantly though, alpha cells produce glucagon and beta cells produce insulin. And what we can see on this diagram here is how these antagonistic hormones work to regulate and maintain glucose homeostasis. So let's break this diagram down a little bit. So right in the middle here, we can see our homeostatic level. So blood glucose level about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. So this is the range in which we need to be to stay functioning healthily. What we can see, let's follow the bottom part of the diagram first. So let's say we skip a meal. So we're rushing early in the morning or during the day and we miss breakfast, or maybe we miss breakfast and we miss lunch. Well, what will happen then is our blood glucose levels will drop, and this acts as a stimulus. And that stimulus will be detected by the nervous system. And what that will do then is send out a response, or send out a motor output, if you like, to the pancreas to start secreting glucagon. So you can see here the alpha cells of the pancreas are stimulated to release glucagon into the blood. Where does that then go? Well, the glucagon will then go to our stores of glycogen. And where are our stores of glycogen? Well, they are in our liver and in our muscles. So the glucagon will essentially switch on hydrolytic enzymes that start to break down that glycogen into glucose. The glucose then gets into our blood, which raises the level of glucose in our blood, obviously, which should then bring us back up to within our optimal range. And everybody's happy. If, however, instead of skipping breakfast, you wake up and decide to eat half a cake and wash it down with a can of Coke for breakfast, well, probably I wouldn't recommend that. But essentially what will happen then is your blood glucose levels will rocket. So they will start to rise. And instantly then, that will become the stimulus. So now rising blood glucose levels, so for instance, after eating a carbohydrate-rich meal, like our cake and can of Coke for breakfast, well, that is then again detected, and a message is sent to the beta cells of the pancreas, and they are stimulated to release insulin into the blood. Now, insulin courses around our body, and insulin acts in two major ways. The first way it acts is it encourages our body cells to take up more glucose. So our cells basically switch on specific, or they open up specific glucose channels, which we'll look at on the next slide, to start importing glucose into the cells. What we also find is that the liver specifically will take up lots of glucose and convert it into glycogen. So we're going to convert it into glycogen, where we can then obviously save it for use later on. And then by these two modes of action, what this should do is reduce the amount of glucose that's coursing around in our bloodstream. And then that should bring our limit back down to within our homeostatic levels. And again, this works like a figure of 8, essentially. So you can see it down here. We're constantly just sort of making, or our body is constantly making minute adjustments to this to maintain this homeostatic level. What we can see here then is the actual modes of action regarding insulin. So this is actually how insulin works. And I've chosen insulin as it's the one that we tend to be more familiar with because of diabetes. So diabetes, you're probably aware, comes in two types, type 1 and type 2. And type 1 is essentially where a person does not produce insulin, essentially. And type 2 diabetes is where you can produce insulin, but your body doesn't respond to it in the way that it should. So obviously neither one is very good at all. So insulin reduces blood glucose levels by promoting the cellular uptake of glucose and slowing glycogen breakdown in the liver. And it will also promote fat storage. So it has a few different modes of action, or does a few different things. And what we can see here are two different ways in which it works. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, we can see what happens within a muscle cell. So remember, muscle cells, they use a lot of glucose because they need ATP to generate muscle contractions. So what we can see up here, this is the plasma membrane. And up here we can see our receptor protein. And then the little yellow ball here, this is our insulin. So insulin comes along and it binds to the receptor. This triggers the signal transduction pathway or cascade. And in this case, what it causes is something called exocytosis. And that is the movement here of these GLUT4 proteins. So these are essentially channel proteins that are here within the cytoplasm. Well, part of the response to the signal transduction is for these channels to move and embed within the plasma membrane of the muscle cells. So you can see that's what's happening here. And then once they are in place, you can see them over here. So these are those channel proteins. Now they are in place. They act as channels for glucose to start diffusing into the muscle cells. So essentially what insulin does in this case is it enables facilitated diffusion. So you can see here, these are the glucose. So you've got a high concentration here, low concentration inside the cell. So it's just the diffusion of glucose from the blood into the cell through these special proteins. So it's a type of facilitated diffusion. Over here we can see the liver cell, and again insulin comes along, it binds to the receptor, and in this case we have the signal transduction pathway or the signal transduction cascade. And in this case what happens is we've got similar carrier proteins or channel proteins. So we've got the GLUT2s. They will now allow glucose in, but in liver cells what the insulin does is it switches on specific enzymes that start converting our glucose into glycogen. What it's also doing is it's converting glucose, which you can see down here, which will enable the concentration gradient to be sustained, because as glucose moves in, it's changed, which helps to maintain the concentration gradient of high glucose out here, low glucose inside the liver cell, because as soon as it moves in, it gets changed by those enzymes. So glucose will start or continue to flow in. So that was the mode of action of insulin then, which is used to reduce our blood glucose levels. And as we know, if our blood glucose levels drop and we need to get them back up again, we will respond by producing glucagon. And glucagon will increase blood glucose levels by stimulating the conversion of glycogen to glucose in the liver and the muscles. So we're basically switching on enzymes to start breaking down that glycogen that we store during the good times. And what we can also do is start breaking down, or what glucagon does is it starts breaking down fat and protein into glucose as well. So glucagon is all about getting the blood glucose levels up, because it's a very important thing. It's maintaining that homeostatic level. You want enough glucose in your blood so you can keep you can keep delivering glucose to the cells where it can be used to generate ATP for cellular functions. But you don't want so much glucose in your blood that you start having an impact on the osmolarity of your blood, which is the solute concentration, because as you know, that will start to have an impact on osmosis. So it will start to, as your blood glucose levels start to increase, the osmolarity or the solute concentration of your blood increases, and then that will start to draw water out of your cells via osmosis. So water will move from an area of low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. And if that happens, as we've established in a previous session where we looked at cell membranes, if water leaves the cell because the cells are in a hypertonic solution, they will shrivel up and they will die. Very important that our blood and our tissues maintain the correct osmolarity or solute concentration. Blood glucose levels are an important part of that. The next one we need to look at is the control of blood calcium levels. And in a previous session, we've looked at, well, actually in a couple of our previous sessions, we've looked at some of the important roles of calcium. So calcium in our last session on nervous systems, we saw being a very important component of the nervous systems with synapses. So the action potentials trigger the opening of calcium channels within the synaptic terminals to enable neurotransmitters to move into the synaptic cleft. In another session, we looked at muscle contractions, and we saw that calcium is really important in muscle contractions within the sliding filament model to bond to the troponin complex to open up access to the myosin binding sites on the actin. Calcium is really important within the body, so it's essential that we have the right amount within our blood at all times. And just like with blood glucose, we have two antagonistic hormones again that are responsible for regulating the homeostasis of calcium within our blood. And those two hormones, well, first one, we've got the parathyroid hormone, often shortened to just PTH. This is released by the parathyroid gland. So if we look at the diagram up here, we can see the thyroid gland, and then the parathyroid gland are those small sections located on the thyroid gland. The parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid glands, and what that will do is increase the amount of calcium within the blood, and we'll look at how this happens in a sec. And then the opposite of that is calcitonin, and calcitonin is released by the thyroid gland, and that is responsible for lowering the blood calcium levels. So between these two, they work antagonistically to regulate our blood calcium levels to keep them within homeostatic levels. So how do they work? Well, parathyroid hormone will increase the levels of blood calcium. So how does it do that? Well, it releases calcium from our bones, and it will stimulate the kidneys to reabsorb more calcium. Those are two really important modes of action there. And what we can also see is that it will have an indirect effect as it stimulates the kidneys to activate vitamin D, which will promote the uptake of calcium from our food in our intestines. So we can see some very, very different but incredibly powerful reactions to parathyroid hormone. So if you aren't getting enough calcium in your diet, because calcium is so important to maintaining basic functions that enable life to exist, so muscle contractions and the nervous systems to just basic nervous system functions, your body will always ensure that you have enough calcium in your blood, even if that means starting to break down your bones. So it's important that we always have enough calcium within our blood. We can get too much calcium in our blood though, and again, think about the relationship that it has with the solute concentration within our blood. So if we get too much, well, calcitonin will be produced, and this will decrease the level of blood calcium. And the main way it does this is to stimulate calcium deposition in bones. Obviously, we can take calcium from our bones when we're low on calcium, but when we've got plenty of calcium available, we can put it back into our bones. And then we can also calcitonin will also increase the secretion of calcium through our kidneys and into our urine. So these are a pair of antagonistic hormones produced by the parathyroid glands and the thyroid gland to regulate our blood calcium levels within homeostatic levels. And you can see the homeostatic levels here. So we're looking at about 10 milligrams of calcium per 100 milliliters of blood. And just on this diagram, you can see the response of falling blood calcium levels. So that will be the stimulus. That will trigger the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. And that will stimulate the uptake of calcium in the kidneys. And it will stimulate the release or breakdown and removal of calcium from our bones. And then we've also got the activation of vitamin D, which increases calcium uptake through the intestines from our food. And then those three modes of action should help to bring our blood calcium levels back up to within our homeostatic levels again. So you can see there's an awful lot going on within our body. We've just looked at two specific things. So we've looked at regulating blood glucose levels and regulating blood calcium levels. So there's an awful lot going on within the body in relation to hormones. Okay, well, as always, We'll finish off by going through a quick recap quiz, but let's go through these 5 questions. And so as always, I'll read through the questions. I'll give you 5 minutes to answer the questions, and then we'll finish off by going through the answers together. So question number 1, what 3 classes of molecules make up hormones? Number 2, why do only target cells respond to hormones? Number 3, put these in the correct order. So we've got signal transduction, reception, and then response. And then number 4, where would the receptors for a water-soluble hormone be located? And then number 5, where is melatonin produced and what does it do? Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes to answer those, and then we'll go through the answers together. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a chance to answer those. Let's go through the answers. So question number 1, what 3 classes of molecules make up hormones? Well, we've got proteins or peptides or polypeptides. We have amines, and then we have the steroids. Number 2, why do only target cells respond to hormones? And that's because they have the correct receptors or the correct receptor proteins. Number 3, put these in the correct order. Well, it goes reception, signal transduction, and then response. Number 4, where would the receptors for a water-soluble hormone be located? They would be embedded within the plasma membrane of the target cell. And then number 5, where is melatonin produced and what does it do? Well, it's produced within the pineal gland and it controls our sleep-wake cycles. Okay, so hopefully you did okay with those. But as always, if you didn't do quite as well as you'd hoped, it's the sort of thing you just need to go over a few times, keep plugging away, keep working at it, and then eventually you'll get the swing of it. So that brings us to the end of this session then, which is a quick introduction to the endocrine system and hormones. So in this session, we have looked at the endocrine glands, so their main endocrine glands, their location, and the hormones that they produce. We've talked a little bit about hormones, so what they are and what they do. We've talked about how they act, so we've talked about hormonal pathways. And then we went on to look at a couple of specific hormones in particular, or a few hormones in particular. So we looked at the hormones involved in maintaining blood glucose levels, so insulin and glucagon. And then we also looked at the role of the hormones calcitonin and parathyroid hormone used in regulating our blood calcium levels. So these are examples of homeostasis within the body. Anyway, hopefully that session was interesting and useful, and I will see you in the next session. Thanks very much.